At the will reading, my son smiled the entire time the lawyer read through the preliminary paperwork, glancing occasionally at his wife, with the particular satisfaction of a man who already knows exactly how a story ends. Then the lawyer said one sentence, and I watched that smile disappear from his face, like someone had reached across the table and physically removed it.
Before we continue to the distribution of assets, I need to read a supplementary document Mr. Whitfield filed 11 days before his passing, which supersedes several provisions in the original will you may already be familiar with. My son's hand, resting on the conference table, went very still. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in that room, and exactly what led up to it, because I think there's something important in this story about what happens when you spend a lifetime being underestimated by the people who should know you best.
My name is Edith. I'm 73 years old, and I was married to a man named Robert Whitfield for 46 years before cancer took him 8 months ago. This is the story of the will reading that changed everything my son thought he understood about his father and about me. If you've ever been treated like the quiet, unimportant spouse in a room full of people making decisions about your own life, stay with me until the end, because this story does not go where you'd expect. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from.
Let me take you back. Not to that conference room, to the man my husband actually was, underneath the version our son thought he knew.
Robert built a small chain of hardware stores from a single location he opened in 1979, back when we were both 26 years old, and had exactly $400 between us after the down payment on the building. I want you to understand that Robert was not a flashy man. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for as long as I knew him, drove a truck until it had well over 200,000 miles on it, and turned down every opportunity anyone ever offered him to expand into something bigger, flashier, more visible. A business doesn't need to be big to be.
Good, Edith, he used to say. It needs to be honest, and it needs to last. By the time he passed, that single hardware store had become 6 locations across 3 counties, quietly profitable, quietly respected. The kind of business that never made headlines, but that everyone in our community relied on for 4 decades. Robert handled the stores. I handled, without either of us ever discussing it as a formal arrangement, everything else. The books, actually, though almost nobody outside our immediate family knew that. I'd studied accounting before we married, at a small state college 2 towns over, back when women in our community rarely finished that kind of
degree, commuting an hour each way on a bus because we couldn't afford for me to live on campus. My own mother thought it was a waste of time, told me more than once that I'd end up keeping house regardless of what letters came after my name. Robert never once said anything like that. He'd never treated my education as decorative, not from our very first year of marriage, when he'd come home from the store exhausted and find me at the kitchen table with a ledger spread out in front of me, and instead of being threatened by it, the way I know some men of his generation would have been, he simply asked what I'd found.
From the very first year of that first store, I did the real bookkeeping, the tax planning, the long-term financial strategy, while Robert handled the customer-facing side, the relationships, the community trust that made people choose us over the big box stores that eventually moved into our area. I remember, in year 3, catching an accounting error in our supplier contracts that would have cost us nearly $11,000 over the following year, money that at the time would have sunk us entirely. I remember Robert's face when I showed him the numbers. Not surprise exactly, more
like quiet confirmation of something he'd already suspected about the wife he'd married. "You're the reason this place is still standing," he told me that night.
and it's one of maybe 3 times in 46 years I ever heard him say it out loud, though I think he believed it every single day in between.
Our son, Bradley, grew up watching his father run those stores. He never once saw me doing the books, because I did that work quietly, usually late at night, after he'd gone to bed, at a small desk in the corner of our bedroom that Robert had built for me our 2nd year of marriage. Bradley grew up believing, as far as I can tell, that his mother baked, kept house, hosted the occasional dinner party, and otherwise existed plantly in the background of his father's more important, more visible life.
I want to be honest about something. I let him believe that. Partly because it was simpler. Partly, I think now, looking back, because there was something in me that enjoyed being underestimated. It meant I could watch people clearly, without them performing for my benefit, without them adjusting themselves to whatever they thought I wanted to see. Robert used to tease me about it gently. You could run this whole operation without me, and everyone would still think I built it alone, he'd say. And I'd laugh, and neither of us ever felt the need to correct the record.
Bradley grew up, went to business school 2 states away, and came home every summer with new vocabulary: vertical integration, market penetration, scalable growth models, words that Robert smiled faintly over dinner, never dismissive exactly, but with the particular patience of a man who'd learned everything he knew about running a business from actually running one, not from a textbook. Bradley eventually came to work for the family company, not in the stores, but in what he called corporate strategy, a role he'd essentially created for himself after graduating, one that involved a great deal of talking about growth and very little actual involvement in the day-to-day operations his father had built with his own 2 hands. He had an office in the back of the flagship location, a whiteboard covered in phrases like 5-year vision and brand expansion. And I remember visiting once and noticing that the whiteboard hadn't been erased in what looked like months, the same diagrams sitting there, untouched, growing slightly dusty at the edges.
I noticed over the years a pattern in how Bradley spoke about the business, and about Robert, and eventually about me. He respected his father, genuinely, but in the particular way people respect someone they've decided is old-fashioned, someone whose success happened in spite of being conservative and cautious, rather than because of it. He'd bring up expansion plans at family dinners, new locations in other states, a private equity partnership he kept mentioning, an acquisition strategy he'd apparently been quietly developing for years without ever formally presenting it to his. Robert would listen politely, ask a few pointed questions, and gently decline every single time in the same calm voice he used for everything. Not yet, Bradley. Maybe not ever. We're not in a hurry to be something we're not. Bradley would nod, seemingly accepting it, but I watched something tighten in his jaw each time, a frustration he never quite said out loud in front of his father, but that came out more and more over the years in conversations with me, usually when he assumed I'd simply agree with him out of some instinct to be agreeable.
"Mom, Dad's brilliant, but he's stuck in 1985, he told me once, about 3 years before Robert's diagnosis. If I had real authority over the direction of the company, we could triple in size within a decade. He just won't hand over the reins." I remember asking him, gently, whether he'd ever actually looked closely at the books, not the surface numbers, but the real financial architecture of the business, the debt structure, the cash reserves, the careful, unglamorous decisions that had kept 6 stores profitable through 2 recessions while competitors folded around us. "That's not really my area," he said. "That's more of a dad thing, or an accountant thing." He had no idea, saying that he was talking to the accountant. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before he died. In the difficult year that followed, as his health declined, Bradley became more insistent, not less, about his expansion plans,
framing it now gently but unmistakably as something we needed to move on quickly for the company's future, a phrase that always seemed to carry an unspoken second half before Dad isn't here to say no anymore.
About 4 months before Robert passed, in one of his more lucid, energetic weeks, he asked me to sit with him in his study, the same small room where he'd handled paperwork for decades, and he told me something that changed the entire shape of what happened after his death.
"Edith," he said, "I want to update the will. Not the distribution. I've always intended for Bradley to inherit the business, and that hasn't changed. But I want to add something, a condition, and I want you, not our regular family attorney, to be the one who structures it, because you understand this business better than anyone alive, including me."
Over the following weeks, working quietly, mostly at night, the same way I'd always done the real work of that business, Robert and I drafted a supplementary document with a new attorney, a specialist named Diane Okafor, whom neither Bradley nor our longtime family lawyer had ever met. The document was precise. Bradley would inherit full ownership of the company, exactly as originally planned. But the document included a mandatory 2-year transition period, during which all major financial and strategic decisions, including any expansion, acquisition, or restructuring, required sign-off.
From a designated financial officer of the company, and the document named that officer specifically by name.
Robert explained his reasoning to me, sitting in that study, more directly than I think he'd ever spoken about the business in all our years together. "I love our son," he said. "I believe in him. But I've watched him for years talk about tripling this company's size without ever once asking to see the actual numbers behind it. And I think somewhere in the last decade, he stopped seeing you as someone with real expertise and started seeing you as just his mother. I want him to have the company, Edith. I don't want him to destroy it in the first 18 months out of pride or impatience or
A refusal to actually understand what he's inheriting before he starts changing it. I asked him if he was certain, if this wasn't simply grief or fear talking, the way it sometimes does with a difficult diagnosis. He looked at me steadily, the way he had for 46 years, and said, "Edith, you've been running the real spine of this business since we were 26 years old, and our son doesn't even know it. I think it's time he found out, in exactly the moment he needs to find out, not a moment sooner." Over the following weeks, working quietly, mostly at night, the same way I'd always done the real work of that business, Robert and I met with Diane 3 more times, refining the language of the document, making sure it was airtight, making sure it couldn't be challenged or dismissed as the confused wish of a dying man not thinking clearly. Diane was meticulous about that particular concern more than anything else. She'd seen in her career plenty of wills contested on exactly those grounds, and she wanted to make certain that anyone who ever looked closely at this one would find nothing to challenge except the plain, well-documented truth of who had actually been running that business for 4 decades.
I remember one of those late nights, especially, Robert sitting across from me at that small desk, tired in the particular way illness makes a person tired, but still sharp, still entirely himself. "I keep thinking about all the times I let people believe this was just my business," he said. "Customers, suppliers, even our own son. I let that story stand because it was easier, and because, if I'm honest, some part of me liked being seen as the one who built it. I think I owe you more than a line in a will, Edith, but it's what I have left to give."
I told him it was enough. I meant it then, and I still mean it now, though I won't pretend there weren't nights after his diagnosis when I lay awake wondering whether either of us had been fair to Bradley,
keeping him in the dark about something so central to his own inheritance for so many years. Robert and I talked about that too, more than once in that final year. We agreed, in the end, that the unfairness wasn't in revealing the truth. It was in how close we'd come to letting him inherit everything without it.
Robert passed 8 months ago, in the spring, at home, with both Bradley and me at his bedside. I want to tell you that the months between his death and the will reading were simple, but grief rarely is. Bradley and I leaned on each other in ways we hadn't in years, sorting through decades of paperwork, photographs, the accumulated evidence of an entire life together. In some of those quiet months, I almost forgot about the supplementary document sitting in Diane Okafor's office. Almost let myself believe the will reading would be exactly as straightforward as Bradley clearly expected it to.
The day of the reading, Bradley arrived at the attorney's office with his wife, Catherine, both of them dressed carefully, professionally, the way people dress when they expect to be signing important paperwork and want to look the part. He'd mentioned to me in the car on the way over that he'd already had preliminary conversations with a commercial real estate broker about 2 potential new locations. Just exploratory, he said. Just so we're ready to move fast once everything's finalized.
I didn't tell him what was coming. I want to be honest about why. Partly because Diane had advised me it was cleaner, legally, for the document to be presented formally, without prior discussion that could complicate the reading. But partly, if I'm being fully honest with you, because some part of me, the same part that had spent 46 years quietly doing the real work behind a business everyone credited to my husband alone, wanted my son to finally understand, in that exact moment, in front of witnesses, in front of his own wife, exactly how much he'd underestimated about his own.
The lawyer read through the preliminary provisions first: the house, some smaller accounts, a scholarship fund Robert had established at the community college years earlier that neither Bradley nor I had ever discussed openly. Bradley listened with polite, expected patience, occasionally glancing at Catherine with a small, satisfied smile, the smile of a man watching a formality unfold exactly as he'd always assumed it would.
Then the lawyer said the sentence I've already told you about. Before we continue to the distribution of assets, I need to read a supplementary document Mr. Whitfield filed 11 days before his passing, which supersedes several provisions in the original will you may already be familiar with. I watched my son's smile disappear. The lawyer read through the transition clause carefully, methodically, the 2-year window, the requirement for sign-off on major decisions, and finally, the name of the designated financial officer responsible for that oversight.
Edith Whitfield, the lawyer read, in recognition of her role as the company's de facto chief financial officer for the entirety of its 46-year operation, a role never formally titled, but extensively documented in the attached financial records, which Mr. Whitfield specifically requested be entered into evidence alongside this provision.
Bradley turned to look at me, and I watched approximately 6 different emotions cross his face in the span of about 4 seconds. Confusion first, then something that looked almost like offense, a kind of "surely there's been some mistake" expression. Then, as the lawyer continued reading through the attached financial documentation, decades of tax filings, financial projections, and strategic memos, every single one bearing my handwriting, my analysis, my signature on internal documents, Bradley had apparently never once looked closely enough to notice, something closer to genuine shock.
"Mom," he said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, "you did all of this?"
Since we were 26 years old, I said. Every tax filing, every expansion decision your father ever made, he made after running the real numbers past me first, which location to bet on, in which to walk away from. I've been doing this work for 46 years, Bradley. You just never asked.
Catherine, beside him, had gone very quiet, her expression somewhere between fascination and, I think, a kind of vindication I didn't fully understand until later. She told me afterward, privately, that she'd suspected for years there was more to me than Bradley ever acknowledged, but had never felt it was her place to say so. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Bradley asked, and I could hear, underneath the shock, something that sounded almost like hurt, which surprised me more than his earlier reaction had.
I want to tell you what I said, because I've thought about it many times since. I think somewhere along the way, it became easier not to correct you, I said. And I think your father and I both let that happen for longer than we should have, because it was comfortable, and because neither of us wanted to make you feel smaller in front of the business you were going to inherit. But your father spent his last months worried that you'd take this company and change everything about it within the first year, without ever once consulting the person who actually understands why it survived for
4 decades. He wanted you to have the company, Bradley. He just wanted you to have it with your eyes open. There's a detail from that afternoon I haven't told you yet, because I think it matters more than anything the lawyer read aloud. About 20 minutes after the reading concluded, while Bradley was still sitting there, absorbing everything, Catherine leaned over and asked to see the attached financial documents herself. She spent almost 10 minutes reading through pages of my handwriting, my analysis, decades of it, and when she finally looked up, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her husband.
"Bradley," she said quietly, "I've been telling you for 3 years that you needed to actually understand the numbers before you kept pushing this expansion. I didn't know I was telling you to talk to your own mother."
I found out later, from a conversation with Catherine over coffee a few weeks after the reading, that she'd suspected for a long time there was more to me than either of us had ever openly discussed. She'd noticed, she said, the way I asked pointed, specific questions at family dinners whenever Bradley brought up his plans, questions that were never quite as simple as they sounded, and she'd wondered more than once where exactly those questions were coming from. She just hadn't felt it was her place to say anything. The same instinct, I realized, that had kept me quiet about my own role.
For over 4 decades, I want to tell you what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because I think it matters more than the drama of that single afternoon.
Bradley was quiet and somewhat withdrawn for the first several weeks after the reading. I think he needed time to reconcile decades of a certain story about his family, the brilliant, hands-on father and the sweet background mother, with a more complicated truth that required him to look at both of us differently. We had several difficult conversations during that period, some of them painful, Bradley working through what felt, understandably, like a kind of betrayal by omission, even as he also began, slowly, to ask me real questions about the business for what I believe was the first.
One of those conversations, about 3 weeks in, stands out to me more than the others. Bradley came over on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from me at the kitchen table, not the small desk, the actual kitchen table, where we'd eaten thousands of family meals, and asked me, quietly, whether I resented him, whether all those years of watching him talk about the business as though he understood it better than either of his parents had built up some kind of quiet anger in me that he'd simply never noticed.
I told him the truth, which surprised even me a little as I said it out loud for the first time. I didn't resent him. I think, in a strange way, I'd been protecting a version of privacy I didn't fully realize I wanted.
A part of my life that belonged only to me and Robert, untouched by anyone else's expectations or opinions, even our own sons. Being invisible in that specific way had its own kind of freedom, and I hadn't fully reckoned with how much I'd miss that freedom until the will reading took it away from me, all at once, in front of witnesses.
I think I need you to know I'm not angry at you for hiding it, Bradley said. I'm angry at myself for never asking. You were right there at every family dinner for 38 years, and I never once asked you a real question about the thing I claimed to care most about.
The transition period has been underway for about 6 months now. Bradley's expansion plans, the ones he'd been developing quietly for years, turned out, once we actually reviewed them together with the real numbers in front of us, to be more ambitious than the company's cash reserves could safely support. Not a bad idea in principle, but poorly timed, structured in a way that would have required taking on debt levels Robert had spent decades deliberately avoiding. Rather than simply blocking the plan, which I could have done under the terms of the will, I spent 3 weeks working with
Bradley directly, teaching him really for the first time how to read the actual financial architecture of the business his father had built. Together, we restructured his expansion proposal into something more sustainable, a single new location in year 1 instead of 3, financed carefully rather than aggressively, with the kind of measured caution his father had always insisted on.
I used to think Dad's caution was just fear, Bradley told me recently, sitting in that same small study where Robert and I had drafted the supplementary document months earlier. Now I think it might have been the smartest strategy in the whole business, and I just never had the numbers in front of me to understand why. Our relationship isn't exactly what it was before the will reading, and I don't think I'd want it to be. It's more honest now, in a way that took decades to arrive at. He asks me real questions now, about the business, about decisions, about the parts of running a company that don't show up in a glossy strategy presentation. I still do the books, some evenings, at that same small desk Robert built for me, and Bradley has started, occasionally, pulling up a chair beside me, watching, actually watching, the way I imagine he should have been watching all along. Last month, he asked if I'd consider formally training him, not casually, not in passing, but in actual structured arrangement, 2 afternoons a week, going through everything from supplier negotiations to cash flow projections, to the specific judgment calls that go into deciding whether a struggling location is worth saving or worth closing. I said yes, of course, though I told him honestly that some of what I know isn't the kind of thing you can teach in an afternoon. It's the kind of knowledge that accumulates slowly, over decades, the way his father's did, the way mine did, through thousands of small decisions that only make sense in hindsight. He said he understood that, but that he wanted to start anyway, and that felt to me like the most meaningful thing he could have said. I don't know if the company will look exactly the same in another 20 years. I suspect it won't, and I suspect Robert would have been all right with that, as long as whatever changes came were made by someone who genuinely understood what he was changing, rather than someone impatient to prove a point about how the previous generation had gotten it wrong. I think about Robert often in that study, about the conversation where he told me it was time our son finally understood what our family actually was, underneath the story he'd been telling himself about it for 38 years. I think he was right that it needed to happen in exactly that moment, in that room, in front of witnesses. Not because I wanted to embarrass our son, but because some truths only really land when you can't quietly explain them away afterward. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, even the ones who love you,
I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Bradley finally opened his first new store under our joint oversight and whether it succeeded, that's a story too. Let me know.
One more thing before I go. Diane Okafor called me last week just to check in, the way lawyers who've handled something meaningful sometimes do. She told me she still thinks about that room, the exact moment the smile left my son's face, and she said something I've been turning over ever since. Your husband didn't leave you power, Edith, she said. He just finally let everyone see the power you already had. I think that's the truest thing anyone has said to me since Robert passed, and I think it's the reason I finally decided to tell this story at all.
Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.